With the recent release of Venom: The Last Dance and the upcoming release of Kraven the Hunter, it's led to new reports that Sony's Marvel are continuing to work on their 10 years in the making Sinister Six movie involving Venom, Kraven, Vulture, Morbius and Madame Web? Really? This leaves me super confused as this does not feel like the Sinister Six. While I'm not against the idea of a Sinister Six film and I would love to see them on the big screen facing off against Spidey, Sony's handling of this idea has me worried, and I don't think Sony properly understand the Sinister Six and what makes them special. So let's talk about it. Hello and welcome to Cinemaze, and if you're new here, be sure to subscribe to see more videos like this. Sony's Marvel have been trying to make a Sinister Six film for a long time now, to the point where their forced setup of the Six contributed to the death of the Amazing Spider-Man universe, and they may be leading their current Sony universe down a similar path. It feels like they're making this movie to prove a point, to prove that the idea from the previous universe could still work, even though it makes even less sense now. It feels like they're looking at the characters that they own and trying to build their own version of the Avengers, even though that is not and has never been what the Sinister Six are. Let's start by talking about the Sinister Six in the comics and what they are, because they represent a very specific corner of the Spider-Man universe. Sure, at first glance, it's the idea of taking 6 Spider-Man villains and teaming them up to fight Spidey, but it's actually a bit more nuanced than that. While the team does have a rotating roster, it isn't traditionally the biggest and baddest Spider-Man villains on the team. Eddie Brock's Venom has only appeared temporarily on the team for one issue, Green Goblin has only joined the Sinister 12, and Carnage has only appeared on the imaginary Sinister 60. Other than Dr. Octopus, this team is more about taking B and C-list villains and combining them together to create something greater, to an A-list threat. Traditionally, we have Doc Ock, Mysterio, Vulture, Electro, Sandman, and Kraven on this roster, but we often see other characters from this similar corner of the Spider-Man universe like Rhino, Scorpion, and Shocker. Not the unknown one-off villains, recurring Spider-Man villains, but not the most famous and the most threatening. The idea really is that they appear still relatively early in Spidey's career, after Spider-Man has faced these villains one-on-one. As Spidey's still early in his career, he's begun taking down these supervillains, upsetting the criminal underworld, and making long-term enemies. He's still quite naive and not realizing the enemies and threats he is inadvertently making. These tend to be pretty grounded villains within the criminal underworld of New York, and they aren't necessarily personal villains to Peter Parker, but instead villains who have a hatred towards Spider-Man, and they join the team usually for revenge against him. Because they aren't necessarily the best Spider-Man villains, they don't make a good team, they don't work together well, and they're all in the team for personal revenge or selfish reasons. Their first appearance ends with them fighting Spider-Man one-on-one rather than as a team, and often Spidey uses their lack of teamwork against each other. We get a great version of the Sinister Six in the spectacular Spider-Man cartoon. We have individual episodes of Spidey facing these villains, making enemies, impacting the criminal underworld, and then the master planner, Doc Ock, brings them all together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. But Spider-Man is able to overcome the odds and take them down on his own. Similarly, in Spider-Man the PS4 game, the villains will exist, they all have personal agendas against Spider-Man, Doc Ock brings them together, they overwhelm Spider-Man, but he's able to bounce back. The point I want to hammer home here is that part of the team is that they are not the biggest Spider-Man villains, but instead established villains with a hatred towards him. Enemies that Spider-Man has inadvertently made along his crime-fighting career that are brought together by the best of these villains for something greater. They feel grounded, usually joining the team for revenge, personal gain, or as hired muscle. It's not anti-Peter Parker, it's anti-Spider-Man, and he takes on the Six solo against all odds and manages to win. The team are intrinsically tied to Spider-Man. So tying this to the films, firstly, we almost had a Sinister Six film in the Amazing Spider-Man universe. This was being set up with the Gentleman appearing at the end of the first film to meet Lizard, and again appearing in the second to showcase a hallway of villains and meet with the Green Goblin who wants to assemble a team. Just off the bat, this is such a lazy way to make the Six. They shouldn't just be characters put in outfits and told to fight Spider-Man. It's far more interesting when they already know Spider-Man separately and they get brought together. And the second film's heavy setup of these villains contributed to the negative reception of that movie. Really, they should have taken more films to set up the villains more slowly. We have further information which came from different producers, including longtime Spidey franchise killer Avi Arad, and it just sounds bad, including that Spider-Man probably would not feature and that it would be a redemption story for the characters. What? How can you make a Sinister Six film without Spidey, especially if most of them haven't met him before? And making it a redemption story is bizarre. Sure, we have seen a lot of sympathetic Spider-Man villains, but in the comics, except for Sandman, that isn't what the Sinister Six are. These guys are normally lowlifes, scum. There's no redemption for them. They aren't usually doing this for noble reasons. They're doing this for revenge on Spider-Man. So it just seems to completely miss the point. Now, not much else is known about the film. We know that Drew Goddard was signed on to direct. He's the creator of season 1 of Daredevil, and he was a name thrown into the hat for the new Spider-Man 4. More about that in my other video. And apparently he may still be signed on for Sony's new version of the Sinister Six. Now, according to him, he wanted to make a more classic adaptation of the group, including Doc Ock as the leader rather than the Green Goblin direction we see in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and he wanted to include Spider-Man and make it a team up against him rather than something like the Suicide Squad. So he seems to get it a bit more, but his draft has Spider-Man riding a T-Rex, so maybe not. It seems like Sony knew they wanted to make a team up to rival the Suicide Squad, Guardians of the Galaxy or the Avengers, but clearly had no idea what direction to take it. And frustratingly, it feels like we're still in that same situation. Sony are desperate for their big team up film, and they've taken Vulture out of the MCU to team him up with Morbius. And based on the reports, Venom, Kraven and Madame Web will all be involved in this team up too. How? Only one of these characters has an existing relationship with Spider-Man. The Sinister Six is so deeply rooted to Spidey, how can you do this team up without him? Sony struggled to make a Venom trilogy interesting without Spidey, and Venom can exist more as a character on his own without Spidey than a Sinister Six can. And if they couldn't sort out a deal to get Spider-Man to appear in a liked enough Venom trilogy, how the hell are they expecting to find a way to get Spider-Man in a Sinister Six movie where some of the characters are pretty hated? And let's talk about that roster. Okay, Vulture, sure, he's a villain, he knows Spidey, and he is on the original comics team. Kraven, he's in the comics, he's on the original team, but it seems like he's not a villain in his movie, so he's more of an anti-hero, and of course, he doesn't know Spider-Man yet. Venom, again, not really a villain in his universe, and Venom is normally a Peter Parker villain, and he doesn't really fit the vibe of the Six. Venom is usually high profile enough to exist as a threat outside of the Six. Morbius is again more of an anti-hero, not historically on the comics team, and Madame Web is just not a villain or an anti-hero at all. She has absolutely no place on this team. So what is this? We have a team mixed with villains, anti-heroes and heroes, most of whom have no connection to Spider-Man, and we expect them to team up and do what? Fight Spider-Man? That's the implication in Morbius, right? I guess if Noel doesn't cross over with Spidey, maybe they all team up to fight Noel. That probably makes sense for the universe that they're in, but at that point, they aren't the Sinister Six. They're just the venom-verse version of the Avengers with way worse solo movies. Like, Sinister is in their name. They kind of need to be villains. They aren't the Super Six, they're the Sinister Six. I just don't trust Sony with this because so far there is no evidence that they're heading in the right direction or that they understand this team dynamic. Now you might be thinking, what about No Way Home? We had a villain team up involving different established villains who all had a hatred and established relationship to Spider-Man appearing in a movie together. And yeah, it's close. It's almost there. There's moments that feel very Sinister Six, like Lizard grabbing Spidey, throwing him back into a window for Green Goblin to continue pounding on him. But we don't get many of those all villain together moments because they aren't all evil together at the same time. Doc Ock is good for all of the final fight and Green Goblin isn't even involved in the team up. And there are 3 Spider-Men. Usually the point of the Six is one Spidey overcoming the odds and fighting these guys alone using his brains, determination and turning the team against one another. So when it's 3 Spideys versus a team of 3 villains, it's not really the same feeling of the Six. And the most obvious point, there's only 5 of them. Sure, Venom is in the post-credit scene, so there are technically 6 villains in the film, but it doesn't really count if they don't team up or fight. After I recorded and edited this video, I started rereading the Ultimate comics from the 2000s. This is set in an alternate universe to the main Spidey comics, and their version of the Six we get in these comics is actually quite similar to the No Way Home team. In the Ultimate comics, the Six are called, who'd have guessed it, the Ultimate Six, and like the MCU villain team, there's actually only 5 members. They try to convince Spidey to be the 6th member, but it doesn't work. The team lineup is the exact same as the film, except instead of Lizard, we get Kraven in the comics, and even in the comics, he's transformed using animal DNA, so it's kind of similar to the Lizard. Norman Osborn is in the team, which, like I mentioned earlier, is unusual for the main Sinister Six, and he acts as the leader and the main villain of the team. Both teams fight in front of a major US national monument, and they don't take on Spider-Man solo like you'd normally expect. In the film, as mentioned, it's against 3 different Spider-Man, and in the comics, it's against Spidey and the Ultimates, essentially this universe's version of the Avengers. So I just wanted to add this in here because this isn't really a comparison I've heard much of before, but there is a comic team similar to the MCU Multiverse 5. Now, back to the original recording. So sure, this one has some Sinister Six feeling moments, but it's not quite there. However, if Sony were doing their own version of the Six outside of the MCU, I think this would be the most interesting direction to take. Take 2 villains from each Spider-Man franchise, let's say Doc Ock and Sandman from Tobey's, Electro and Rhino from Andrew's, and Vulture and Mysterio from Tom's. You now have a pretty comic accurate team, with Kraven being swapped for Rhino, and honestly, Rhino is one of the most common inclusions in the Six outside of their original appearance. And you can create a team with established villains, with established relationships with Spidey, who audiences care about, and have them act as a multiversal Six who can serve as a way to unite our 3 Spider-Men again in a crossover movie. This isn't the perfect version of the Six, but it's far more interesting than whatever the Morbius version will be. But it's also a lot harder since No Way Home kind of did this and also cured a lot of of the villains. Honestly, the best representation of the Sinister Six in film isn't doing the multiversal 5 in No Way Home, or showing all the villain tech in a hallway creating villains who have no established relationship with Spidey, and it definitely isn't Vulture in a new universe meeting Morbius talking about Spider-Man, despite the fact that Spider-Man doesn't exist in that world. No, they exist in much better movies. Firstly, not even in a Spider-Man film, but in The Batman. Yep, that's right, in The Batman, at the end, we hear the Joker making a partnership in Arkham Asylum with the Riddler. Two villains who have been wronged by Batman teaming up to escape and get revenge. That feels very Sinister Six to its core. And secondly, the closest we've got in a Spider-Man movie is in Homecoming, when Vulture and Scorpion meet in jail, and Scorpion wants revenge on Spider-Man. It shows how different criminals are becoming personal enemies with Spider-Man for different reasons, ending up in jail together, and through an uneasy, reluctant alliance could escape and get revenge for their own specific personal reasons. This scene felt so Sinister Six, and it's a real shame that it's in jeopardy for a Sinister Six in a completely different universe. Because honestly, that MCU Sinister Six tease, which was considered to be the plan for Holland's Spider-Man originally, is the most interesting version. This isn't a team that should have their own movie, but they should act as the major finale for the MCU Spider-Man, setting up each villain over 6 films. Let's take Vulture from Homecoming and also bring back the Shocker. Obviously, we've got Mysterio from Far From Home. We all know he's not really dead. We skip No Way Home. That's a weird one-off multiversal film. So we go to Spider-Man 4. If Sony don't ruin it and we actually get the grounded Spider-Man and Daredevil versus Kingpin movie that we all want and that Marvel want, we take the Kingpin for the Sinister Six, and then Spider-Man 5, we might get someone like Mr. Negative. There's a few pieces in place for him to exist in the MCU. Now we have 5 villains. Throw in Matt Gargan, who already exists, give him the Scorpion suit. Now we have 6 individual villains who have all been set up over time and all have different personal relationships with Spider-Man. Most of them are kind of low-life villain scum. They aren't really people who deserve redemption, but villains who Spider-Man has slowly built up over time as he upsets the criminal underworld of the MCU. Sure, it's not the most classic Sinister Six lineup, but we know that the Spider-Man corner of the MCU is not that traditional without Oscorp or Otto Octavius, so I'd accept a less than usual lineup. And honestly, we still feel a lot of the archetypes of the usual Sinister Six. Obviously, you've got Vulture and Mysterio, then you've got your cruel, heartless hunter looking for revenge, you've got a guy who shoots energy, usually there for revenge or as hired muscle, you've got your more sympathetic character, and then you've got your brains behind the operation who brings them all together, and he's usually the most established of the Spider-Man villains. I think that's a pretty solid lineup, and it captures the feeling the Sinister Six needs. Grounded villains Spidey has slowly made enemies with over time who get together for revenge, and that's a far more interesting place to take Tom Holland's Spider-Man compared with fighting Null in the multiverse or fighting Morbius. And my biggest problem with the venomverse is the detriment that it can cause to Tom Holland's Spider-Man arc. Sure, the Venom movies kind of suck, but they can be seen as dumb fun that you can enjoy. But if they start making decisions like taking Vulture out of the MCU or like putting Null in Spider-Man 4, these dumb, fun side movies are beginning to impact the actual good Spider-Man film. And that's what frustrates me about them. They don't exist in their own weird corner of the multiverse. They're beginning to take away from Spider-Man because Sony want the 4 spin-off films to be made that have no right to be made. The Sinister Six, consisting of grounded villains built up slowly, is the natural place to finish Tom Holland's Spider-Man hexology before we start introducing Miles Morales in the 3rd trilogy. And unfortunately, it's being compromised because Sony rush things. They don't do it properly, they repeat their same mistakes, and they fundamentally do not understand the characters. And based on everything we know, they certainly don't understand the Sinister Six. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts on the Sinister Six in the comments below. Would you be interested in the Venom Morbius version, or would you rather it was saved for the MCU? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to see more content like this going forward. But for now, thanks for watching. Cinemaze.